On March 15, 2025, the United States launched what the White House called a deportation operation into Venezuela. Military aircraft, special operations forces, a sovereign nation's airspace violated without permission. The official reason? Gang members, criminals, threats to American security. The real reason is worth $1.4 trillion. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest on Earth. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, larger than the entire Middle East combined. At current prices, that's $1.4 trillion worth of crude in the ground. And for the past decade, that oil has been flowing not to American refineries, but to Chinese ports. This isn't about deportations. This isn't about gang violence. This isn't about protecting American borders. This is about the largest resource grab since Iraq. Here's what nobody in mainstream media is telling you. There's a pattern. A four-stage mechanism that is executed every time the United States has moved against an oil-rich nation over the past 70 years. Iran in 1953, Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011. The playbook is identical. The outcome is identical. The wealth transfer is identical. And right now, that pattern is executing in real time. Not in the Middle East, in America's backyard. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how resource extraction operations work. You'll see the three historical precedents that prove this pattern is systematic, not coincidental. And you'll recognize why Venezuela isn't just about oil. It's about the final battle for dollar hegemony. The wealth transfer has already begun. The only question is who ends up holding the assets when the dust settles. Let me show you how this works. Every major American intervention in an oil-rich nation over the past 70 years has followed an identical four-stage pattern. I call it the resource extraction spiral. The name isn't editorial, it's descriptive. Once you see the mechanics, the spiral becomes undeniable. Each stage builds the justification for the next. Each stage escalates the intervention. And each stage is presented to the American public as something other than what it actually is. Stage 1. The demonization. A leader who controls significant resources becomes an official enemy. Not because of human rights, not because of democracy, because they threaten dollar-denominated resource flows. The media apparatus activates. Stories of atrocities circulate. Humanitarian concerns suddenly become urgent. The leader is compared to Hitler, Stalin, the worst figures in human history. During Stage 1, no military action is proposed. The goal is psychological preparation. Make the target nation's leadership so toxic that intervention becomes thinkable. This stage typically lasts 2 to 5 years. Stage 2. The economic strangulation. Sanctions begin. Not targeted sanctions against individuals. Comprehensive sanctions that cripple the civilian economy. The official justification is always pressure on the regime. The actual effect is collective punishment of the population. Here's the mechanism nobody discusses. When you sanction a nation's oil exports, you don't hurt the leadership. They have foreign reserves, they have alternative buyers, they survive. You hurt the civilians, hospitals run out of medicine, food becomes scarce, inflation destroys savings, the middle class evaporates. This creates the conditions for Stage 3, a desperate population, a weakened state, internal fractures that can be exploited. Stage 3, the trigger event. Every intervention requires a justification, something that transforms "we want their resources" into "we must protect our security." The trigger is always crafted to be emotionally overwhelming and logically thin. Weapons of mass destruction, imminent threat, terrorist connections, something that short-circuits rational analysis. The trigger doesn't need to be true. It needs to be believed long enough for the operation to begin. Stage 4, the extraction. This is when the actual wealth transfer occurs. Military operations secure the resource infrastructure. New governments are installed. Contracts are renegotiated. Assets that belong to the target nation's people become assets controlled by foreign corporations. The extraction isn't immediate. It happens over years, sometimes decades. But the trajectory is locked in the moment Stage 4 begins. The American public sees liberation, freedom, democracy. The financial records show something different. Resource flows redirected, contracts awarded to connected firms, reconstruction loans that create permanent debt dependency. This pattern has executed in Iran, Iraq, and Libya. The details vary. The structure is identical. And right now, Venezuela is entering stage 3. Let me prove it to you with history. Let me take you back to where the playbook was written. Iran, 1953, the first modern resource extraction operation, and the template for everything that followed. In 1950, Iran held the largest proven oil reserves in the Middle East. The Abadan refinery was the largest in the world, and every drop of that oil was controlled by a single British company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Today you know it as BP. Here's the arrangement. Iran received 16% of oil revenues. Britain received 84%. The contracts were written during the colonial era. The terms were non-negotiable. In 1951, the Iranian parliament did something revolutionary. They voted to nationalize their own oil. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister on a single mandate: Iranian oil for Iranian people. The nationalization passed unanimously. The population celebrated in the streets. Britain's response was stage 1 of the resource extraction spiral: immediate demonization. Mossadegh was portrayed as a communist sympathizer, a threat to Western civilization, an unstable fanatic who would hand Iran to the Soviet Union. None of this was true. Mossadegh was a secular nationalist. He had no Soviet connections. He simply wanted Iran to control Iranian resources. But truth wasn't the point. Perception was the point. Stage 2 followed immediately. Economic strangulation. Britain organized a global boycott of Iranian oil. They blockaded Iranian ports. They pressured international oil companies to refuse Iranian crude. Iranian oil exports collapsed from 660,000 barrels per day to nearly zero. The economy went into freefall. Inflation spiked. Unemployment exploded. The middle class that supported Mossadegh began to suffer. Britain couldn't invade unilaterally. The Suez Crisis had proven military adventurism was no longer acceptable. They needed a different approach. They needed the CIA. In 1953, President Eisenhower approved Operation Ajax. The CIA's Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was dispatched to Tehran with a budget of $1 million, approximately $11 million in today's dollars. Stage 3, the trigger event. Roosevelt organized street protests. He paid journalists to publish anti-Mossadegh stories. He bribed military officers. He created the appearance of domestic uprising. On August 19, 1953, the operation executed. Mossadegh's government was overthrown. The Shah, who had fled to Rome days earlier, was restored to power. Iran's brief experiment with democracy ended with CIA-backed tanks in the streets. Stage 4. The extraction. Within weeks, the nationalization was reversed. A new consortium was established. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company received 40%. American oil companies, who had no previous stake in Iran, received another 40%. Iran received slightly better terms than before, but control was gone. The wealth transfer was complete. Here's what that transfer meant in practical terms. Over the next 25 years, Western oil companies extracted approximately $100 billion in value from Iranian oil fields. In today's dollars, that's over $800 billion. The Iranian people who owned those resources saw a fraction of the value. The Shah became a reliable American ally. He purchased billions in American weapons. He stationed American forces on Iranian soil. He tortured dissidents who remembered what democracy felt like. In 1979, the blowback arrived. The Islamic Revolution was, at its core, a reaction to 1953. The resentment had been building for 26 years, but by then, the extraction was complete. The wealth had transferred. The pattern had executed. Same structure, same stages. Stage 1, demonization of nationalist leader. Check. Stage 2, economic strangulation through boycott. Check. Stage 3, CIA organized trigger event. Check. Stage 4, extraction through restored puppet regime. Check. This playbook worked so well that it became doctrine. Let me show you how it executed 50 years later at industrial scale. If Iran 1953 was the pilot program, Iraq 2003 was the industrial rollout. and the pattern is so identical, it's almost embarrassing. Iraq held 145 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the second largest in the Middle East. Unlike Saudi reserves, which were heavily depleted, Iraqi fields were largely undeveloped. Fresh extraction potential worth trillions. In 1972, Saddam Hussein nationalized Iraqi oil, just like Mossadegh. He redirected revenues toward Iraqi infrastructure, education, and military capability. For a decade, this was tolerated. Saddam was useful. He fought Iran. He contained the Islamic Revolution. He was a strategic asset. Then the Cold War ended. Saddam became expendable. Stage 1 began immediately after the 1991 Gulf War. Saddam was no longer a useful dictator. He was Hitler reincarnated. The babies thrown from incubators story, later proven false, was planted by a PR firm called Hill and Knowlton. The imagery was designed for maximum emotional impact. For 12 years, the American public was conditioned to view Iraq as an existential threat. The demonization was relentless. Stage 2 executed throughout the 1990s. The most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history was imposed on Iraq. UN Resolution 1661. Comprehensive embargo on everything except medicine and food. Here's what those sanctions actually did. UNICEF estimated that 500,000 Iraqi children died as a result of sanctions between 1991 and 2003. When Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked whether this price was worth it, she said, "We think the price is worth it." The sanctions didn't remove Saddam. They devastated the civilian population. They destroyed the middle class. They created the conditions for external intervention. Stage 3 arrived in 2002 and 2003. The trigger event was weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented satellite imagery to the United Nations, mobile weapons labs, chemical agents, nuclear programs, imminent threat to American security. None of it was real. The CIA's own analysts had doubts. The intelligence community was divided. The international community was unconvinced. France and Germany refused to participate. But the trigger didn't need to be true. It needed to be believed long enough for the invasion to begin. On March 20th, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom launched. Stage 4, the extraction. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad fell. Within months, the occupation government began restructuring Iraq's economy. Here's the part that never makes it into the history books. Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, issued Order 39. It allowed 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi businesses. It permitted unlimited repatriation of profits. It essentially privatized the entire Iraqi economy for foreign acquisition. The oil contracts followed. Before the invasion, Iraq's oil was controlled by the Iraqi National Oil Company, state-owned, revenues flowing to the Iraqi government. After the invasion, production sharing agreements were signed with ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. These agreements gave foreign companies up to 75% of initial revenues and locked in terms for 20 to 30 years. The wealth transfer was staggering. Between 2003 and 2023, Iraq produced approximately 35 billion barrels of oil. At average prices, that's roughly $2.5 trillion in revenue. The Iraqi people, in theory, still owned the oil. In practice, the extraction terms meant hundreds of billions flowed to foreign shareholders rather than Iraqi development. Meanwhile, the reconstruction. American contractors received $138 billion in contracts. Halliburton alone received $39.5 billion. Much of the work was never completed. Entire projects existed only on paper. The American military spent $2 trillion. American contractors extracted $138 billion. American oil companies locked in 30-year extraction rights. The Iraqi people got chaos, sectarian violence, and a government that couldn't keep the electricity running. But here's the part that matters for understanding Venezuela. Iraq didn't work. Not because the extraction failed. The contracts were signed, the oil flowed, the wealth transferred. It didn't work because it took 20 years, $2 trillion, and 4,500 American lives. The American public has no appetite for another Iraq. So the playbook evolved. Libya 2011 was the optimized version. Same pattern: lower cost, plausible deniability, and a detail that connects directly to Venezuela. Gaddafi's real crime wasn't human rights. It was threatening the dollar. Libya held 48 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in Africa. High-quality, low-sulfur crude that European refineries desperately wanted. But Gaddafi had something more dangerous than oil. He had a plan. In 2009, Gaddafi proposed the gold dinar, a pan-African currency backed by Libya's 144 tons of gold reserves. The idea was simple. African nations would sell oil and resources for gold-backed dinars instead of dollars. Read that again. A gold-backed currency for African oil exports. A direct challenge to dollar hegemony from a continent that holds 30% of the world's mineral resources. Hillary Clinton's emails, released through FOIA requests, explicitly identify the gold dinar as a threat to French and American interests. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented correspondence. Stage 1 had been building for decades. Gaddafi was always portrayed as eccentric, dangerous, a mad dog. The groundwork was already laid. Stage 2 was minimal. Libya wasn't heavily sanctioned because it had normalized relations with the West in 2003. Gaddafi had given up his weapons program. He was cooperating on counterterrorism. That cooperation didn't protect him. It just meant Stage 2 was abbreviated. Stage 3 arrived in February 2011. The Arab Spring provided cover. Protests in Benghazi escalated into armed rebellion. Within weeks, NATO was involved. The trigger was humanitarian intervention. Gaddafi was supposedly about to massacre civilians in Benghazi. The UN passed Resolution 1973 authorizing a no-fly zone. Here's what the no-fly zone became. NATO flew 2,600 sorties over Libya. They dropped over 7,700 bombs. They provided air support for rebel ground forces. They turned a no-fly zone into regime change. The mandate was to protect civilians. The outcome was a dead head of state and a collapsed nation. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was captured and killed by NATO-backed rebels. Secretary Clinton's response captured on camera: "We came, we saw, he died." Stage 4, the extraction. Libya's gold reserves, all 144 tons, vanished during the chaos. Their current location is unknown. Libya's sovereign wealth fund, valued at $67 billion, was frozen under sanctions and remains largely inaccessible to any Libyan government. Libya's oil production collapsed from 1.6 million barrels per day to under 200,000. It has never fully recovered. But here's the critical detail. The wealth transfer in Libya wasn't primarily about what America gained. It was about what the dollar didn't lose. The gold dinar died with Gaddafi. African nations remained locked in dollar dependency. The threat to dollar hegemony was eliminated. Libya also proved something important for future operations. You don't need ground troops. You don't need long occupations. You need air power, proxy forces, and the right media narrative. The cost of regime change in Libya was approximately $1.1 billion for the United States. Compare that to $2 trillion in Iraq. Same outcome. 99.9% cost reduction. Libya became the template. Arm local opposition. Provide air support. Let the country collapse into chaos. Extract what you can from the wreckage. This is the template now being applied to Venezuela. But there's a problem. A $50 billion problem. Now let me show you exactly what's happening in Venezuela right now. And let me give you specific numbers, specific dates, and specific stakes. Because this isn't about deportations. This is about the largest oil reserves on Earth and who controls them. Venezuela holds 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's 18% of all proven oil on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion. More than Iran's 208 billion. At $80 per barrel, Venezuela's reserves are worth approximately $24 trillion. At $100 per barrel, $30 trillion. This is the largest single concentration of hydrocarbon wealth on the planet, and for the past decade, it has been flowing away from American influence. Here's what changed the strategic calculus. Since 2007, China has invested over $50 billion in Venezuela through the China Development Bank. These aren't charity loans, they're resource-backed financing. The arrangement works like this. China provides cash up front. Venezuela repays in oil shipments. Approximately 300,000 barrels per day flow from Venezuelan ports to Chinese refineries. In 2023, China became Venezuela's largest oil buyer, larger than India, larger than any Caribbean refinery. Chinese state-owned companies now hold service contracts across the Orinoco Belt, the largest heavy oil deposit in the world. Venezuela's oil isn't just flowing to China, it's increasingly integrated into Chinese infrastructure. CNPC and Sinopec have technical teams embedded in Venezuelan operations. This is what triggered American escalation, not human rights, not gang violence. The risk that 303 billion barrels of oil become a permanent Chinese strategic asset. Stage 1 has been running for over a decade. Nicolas Maduro has been called a dictator, a drug trafficker, a human rights violator. The State Department has offered $15 million for his arrest. He's been compared to every authoritarian figure in modern history. Is Maduro's government authoritarian? Yes. Is it corrupt? Extensively. Is it meaningfully different from Saudi Arabia, a close American ally? Not particularly. The demonization isn't about values. It's about creating the psychological conditions for intervention, making regime change seem not just acceptable, but necessary. This is where Venezuela differs from Iran, Iraq, and Libya. The sanctions have been comprehensive and sustained. Since 2017, the United States has imposed escalating sanctions on Venezuela. 2017 brought financial sector sanctions blocking access to U.S. capital markets. 2018 brought gold export sanctions. 2019 brought oil sector sanctions, the most devastating. 2020 brought secondary sanctions threatening any company doing business with Venezuela. The oil sanctions alone crashed Venezuela's exports from 2.4 million barrels per day in 2015 to under 400,000 in 2020. The impact on civilians has been catastrophic. GDP contracted by 75% between 2014 and 2020. Hyperinflation peaked at 1.7 million%. 5 million Venezuelans fled the country. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Malnutrition became endemic. The sanctions didn't remove Maduro, just like they didn't remove Saddam, just like they didn't remove Castro for 60 years. But they created the conditions for Stage 3, a weakened state, a suffering population, a pretext for escalation. This is where we are right now. The deportation flights into Venezuela aren't standard immigration enforcement. Military aircraft, armed personnel, incursion into sovereign airspace without permission. The legal justification is thin. The deportees are allegedly gang members from Tren de Aragua, but the scale of the operation, the military involvement, the violation of Venezuelan airspace, this exceeds any deportation protocol in American history. Venezuela responded by detaining American personnel. The United States responded by threatening additional action. The escalation ladder is climbing. Here's what the pattern predicts. A trigger event is being manufactured, something that will justify more significant intervention. Threats to American personnel, evidence of terrorism connections, weapons discoveries, something emotionally compelling and strategically useful. The goal isn't to deport gang members. The goal is to create the conditions for broader action against the Maduro government. But here's where Venezuela differs from every previous case. Russia has significant military presence in Venezuela. Russian mercenaries, Russian weapon systems, Russian diplomatic backing. In 2019, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela as a show of force. They've provided military advisors and equipment throughout the sanctions period. More critically, both Russia and China have made clear that American intervention in Venezuela crosses a line. Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not a country without great power backers. An American military operation in Venezuela risks direct confrontation with two nuclear-armed rivals. This is why the escalation is proceeding through deportation pretexts rather than direct military action. The Libya playbook, air power, and proxy forces may not work when the proxies face Russian weapons and Chinese economic backing. So how does the wealth transfer actually execute in this scenario? Pathway 1. Regime change. A new Venezuelan government, recognized by the United States, cancels Chinese contracts as odious debt, loans made to an illegitimate regime. American companies step in with new financing and service agreements. Oil flow redirects to American refineries. This is the cleanest extraction. It's also the most difficult given Chinese and Russian investment in preventing it. Pathway 2. Managed chaos. Venezuela fragments. The government loses control of oil-producing regions. American allied factions secure key infrastructure. De facto partition without formal regime change. This mirrors what happened in Syria, where different regions are controlled by different powers. Messy but functional for extraction purposes. Pathway 3. Negotiated surrender. Sanctions relief in exchange for Chinese contract renegotiation. American companies get a seat at the table. The wealth transfer is partial, but achieved without military cost. This is the most likely near-term outcome, but it requires leverage that only credible military threat provides. And here's the dimension that elevates this beyond simple resource extraction. Venezuela has been selling oil to China in Yuan since 2019. Every barrel that bypasses the dollar weakens the petrodollar system. If Venezuela successfully transitions to a Yuan-denominated oil economy, backed by Chinese investment and Russian security guarantees, it becomes a template. Other Latin American nations, Bolivia, Colombia, potentially Brazil, see that dollar independence is survivable. The Venezuela operation isn't just about 303 billion barrels. It's about preventing a domino effect that unravels dollar hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The wealth transfer is bidirectional. If America wins, Venezuelan oil flows to American refineries and American companies capture the extraction value. If China wins, the petrodollar loses Latin America. The wealth transfer goes the other way. This is why the stakes are unprecedented, and this is why the escalation will continue. Let me show you what this means beyond Venezuela, because the ripple effects of this confrontation will reshape the global economy regardless of outcome. Any significant escalation in Venezuela impacts global oil supply. Venezuela's current production is approximately 900,000 barrels per day, heavily discounted due to sanctions. If conflict disrupts this supply, or if a new government cancels Chinese contracts, the global market tightens. Conservative estimate: $10–15 per barrel increase in global prices. Aggressive estimate: $25–40 per barrel if conflict expands or production is significantly disrupted. For American consumers, every $10 increase in oil prices adds approximately 0.25 per gallon at the pump. The political timing is notable. An administration that campaigned on lowering gas prices is pursuing a policy that risks raising them, unless the calculation is that long-term control of Venezuelan oil justifies short-term price pain. Venezuela applied for BRICS membership in 2024. If admitted, any American intervention becomes an attack on a BRICS-affiliated state. Brazil, under Lula, has already condemned American actions as violation of sovereignty. China has issued formal protests. Russia has warned of severe consequences. The BRICS response to a Venezuela intervention would accelerate every de-dollarization trend we've discussed. Emergency Yuan-denominated oil trading facilities, sanctions evasion financial networks, perhaps the debut of the long-discussed BRICS common currency. The irony is stark. American action intended to preserve dollar hegemony could trigger the very coalescence that ends it. Latin America is watching. Mexico, under AMLO's successor, has already distanced itself from American Venezuela policy. Colombia, traditionally a reliable ally, has leftist leadership that opposes intervention. If the United States successfully executes regime change in Venezuela, other Latin American governments face a choice: align with Washington or risk similar treatment. If the United States fails, if Venezuela survives backed by Chinese and Russian support, the message is different. Resistance is possible. Either outcome reshapes hemispheric politics for a generation. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to show you what is. But consider the implications. If Venezuelan oil comes under American control, refinery investments in Gulf Coast facilities become attractive. Certain energy stocks benefit. If China secures Venezuelan resources, Yuan-denominated commodity exposure provides hedging value. Real asset ownership outperforms dollar holdings. If conflict escalates, defense contractors see increased revenue. Energy prices spike. Inflation returns. The pattern suggests preparation regardless of outcome. Energy exposure, real assets, geographic diversification, reduced exposure to outcomes you cannot control. The wealth transfer happens one direction or another. The only question is whether you're positioned to benefit or positioned to absorb the loss. Let me bring this back to where we started. Military aircraft entering Venezuelan airspace. A deportation operation that looks remarkably like the opening move in a much larger game. 303 billion barrels, $24 trillion in resources, the largest oil reserves on Earth, and a pattern that is executed identically for 70 years. Iran, 1953. Nationalist leader threatens Western oil control, demonization, economic strangulation, CIA-backed coup, extraction through puppet regime. The template is established. Iraq, 2003. Same pattern. Industrial scale. Weapons of mass destruction trigger. Regime change. 30-year extraction contracts. $2 trillion cost, paid by American taxpayers. Libya, 2011. Optimized version. Gold dinar threat to dollar hegemony. Air power plus proxies. Regime eliminated. 99% cost reduction. Venezuela, 2025. The pattern is executing. Demonization complete. Sanctions devastating the population. Trigger events being manufactured. Extraction pathways being prepared. But this time, the variables are different. China has $50 billion invested. Russia has military assets deployed. BRICS provides alternative frameworks. The world is no longer unipolar. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about whether the United States can maintain the resource extraction model that has underwritten American prosperity for 7 decades. If Venezuela falls into American orbit, the petrodollar survives another generation. Latin America remains in the dollar sphere. Chinese expansion is checked. If Venezuela holds, backed by Chinese capital and Russian security, the model breaks. Other nations see that resistance is viable. The dollar loses the Western Hemisphere. The wealth transfer happens either way. $24 trillion in resources doesn't disappear. It flows somewhere. The only question is direction. This is the largest resource confrontation since Iraq. But unlike Iraq, it's happening in America's backyard, against adversaries who have studied every American playbook, with nuclear-armed powers signaling their limits. The outcome will define whether the United States remains a resource hegemony or whether the 70-year extraction model has reached its end. If this video changed how you understand what's happening in Venezuela, if the pattern is now visible to you, I need you to subscribe. The next video is where I show you exactly how to position during resource confrontations. Which sectors benefit? Which assets protect purchasing power? How wealth transfers execute at the individual level. Because this story is accelerating. The deportation flights were the beginning. The escalation will continue. And the information you need won't be on the evening news until the positions are already set. The pattern has never been clearer. I'll see you in the next one.